Today's daf we're going to learn is Ketubot, Daf Nun Gimel. Today's daf is sponsored by Ricky and Alan Zibit in memory of Ricky's father, Mickey Carlin, Shevach ben Avraham Vemita, whose 14th year at site was on Thursday. Daddy, we miss you every day. Chodesh Tov to everyone. Shavua Tov. Nice to be back on Zoom. Nice to see faces. I missed everybody. And actually, before I start, someone made a comment to me and I wanted to point it out. I mentioned on Friday's daf, I believe it was, about comparing this case of tchilato ba'onos to date rape. It wasn't, I didn't mean to make a clear comparison. It's obviously right, they went to that. It's the opposite really, date rape, which is, right, she's forced in, right, it almost looks in the beginning like it's consensual and then it becomes rape. I didn't mean to say that they were exactly the same thing. What I meant to say is there's this blurring of where the ratzon and where the onus is, right? It was sort of it's the opposite. I meant really that it's a similar, where there's a little bit of a lack of clarity over where the onus is, where the ratzon is. So I just wanted to clarify that. Okay. Starting now from very interesting story. Okay, I want to warn everybody before we get to this daf. It's a very complicated daf. Now, what makes a daf a complicated daf? This is just an interesting thing in general. And today's daf, it's a really good example. Not the first sugya, but after that, it's going to get a little bit complicated. Part of what makes a daf complicated is that the Gemara often isn't, maybe you could say, sometimes it wasn't perfectly edited. And therefore, there's a lot missing that isn't explained in the words, or the words don't seem to fit the question. The answers don't fit the question exactly. Something seems confusing. It's not clear what the simple reading is. And the commentators need to kind of fill in the gaps. And sometimes, sometimes it works great and they fill in all the gaps and everything's good. But usually, right, and especially when it's very complicated, again, what makes it complicated? What makes it complicated is that, like if you read the words and then you read Rashi, you'll see that Rashi is explaining things that doesn't really say in the text, that he has to fill in a lot of details, which means that the text itself is kind of missing information somehow. And maybe it's because of editing. We don't know exactly why it is, but the fact is this is a good example of a daf where there's a lot of lack of clarity. They don't give you enough words that really explain what they're saying. And then you're left with many different possibilities to what those things mean, which makes it very complicated. In order to simplify it for Daf Yomi class, I'm going to go in general with one way of explaining it, even though you should just know that on this daf, there's many different explanations of many different things. You might be, for example, reading in a commentary and say, that's not what she said, but that's because there's different commentaries that take different approaches here. So I'll try to simplify it as best as possible, but it is a complicated daf, I will warn you. It might take us a little longer than some of those shorter dafim over the summer. Okay. Let's get started. We start off with a nice, kind of cute story, a little maybe disturbing a bit, but a story. Rav Papa, I'm starting from 3 lines from the bottom of Nun Bet Amud Bet. Abba Sura'ah. He was marrying off his son to the daughter of Abba Sura'ah. Okay, just to point out, Abba Sura'ah actually was his father-in-law. It's a little bit strange. How's he marrying off his son to his father-in-law's daughter? That's a problem. Arayot, right? He's basically marrying his aunt. But it was a son from a different marriage. Okay. Anyway, we had a story with him and Abba Sura'ah recently. Okay. Anyway, he was trying to marry off. That's not really important to the story. It's just an aside. He's trying to marry off his son to the daughter of Abba Sura'ah. So they go to write a ketuba, which basically means they go to figure out how much money is he giving to the dowry of his daughter. So Rav Papa wants to get as much money as he can out of the dowry for the daughter, right? For his son who's marrying the daughter, he wants it to be a big dowry. Shama Yehuda bar Meriemar. Yehuda bar Meriemar hears what's happening. Nafik Aza, he doesn't really hear what's happening. He hears Rav Papa came to town. So Azal itchazele, he goes to appear before Rav Papa. Out of respect, right? Rav Papa comes to town, he goes to greet him. Kimatu lepitcha, when they get to the entrance of Abba Sura'ah's house, Yehuda bar Meriemar says, okay, bye, I'm going. Amarle, neomar bahadai. He says, come with me into Abba Sura'ah's house. He sees that Yehuda bar Meriemar is very hesitant to come into the house with him. Amarle, my datech. Rav Papa tries to think about what's your issue. So he says, what's the issue? Mishum de Amar le Shmuel Rav Yehuda. Is it because of what Shmuel said to Rav Yehuda? And here starts the quote of what Shmuel said to Rav Yehuda. Shinina, which is a term of endearment he always uses for Rav Yehuda. Lo tahave bi'ibura achsanta. Don't be present when someone's passing on inheritance and deciding which son is getting what. Afilu mibra bisha lebra tuva. Don't get involved when the father's determining which son gets more money, because even if he's giving more money from a bad son to a good son, you never know how your kids are going to turn out, okay? Just because this kid's a bad kid now, maybe he'll turn out to be better than the other kid. So don't get involved here with any kind of inheritance issues. Now, this isn't exactly inheritance. We're going to have to figure out what he's talking about. All the more so from a son to a daughter. Okay, right. Right, bad enough from one son to another, but they're giving money to the daughter instead of to the sons. Now, this is right. Parents always love to say to their kids, it's coming out of your inheritance, right? The fact that he's going to give a good dowry to the daughter is basically coming out of the future son's inheritance. So therefore, Yehuda bar Meriemar, so Rav Papa says, Yehuda bar Meriemar, is it that you don't want to get involved here and you don't want to be influencing Abba Sura'ah about how much money he's giving to his daughter and basically taking away from his sons because of the same that Rav Yehuda, Shmuel said to Rav Yehuda, stay away from any kind of, don't try to influence the inheritance. To which Rav Papa says, if that's your issue, I'll tell you why you should come. We saw it yesterday at the beginning of the section of our Mishnah, the first part of the Gemara, it's about 15 lines from the bottom. Why did they make this ketuba benin dichrin? Remember, that means that the male children will eventually inherit the nedunya, this dowry, in order we want to encourage fathers to write dowries for their daughters. Don't think this is a bad thing that the father's taking inheritance and passing it on from the son to the daughter. This is her dowry, and the rabbi said they should give a big dowry. So why not get involved? To which he answers, Amar le, Yehuda bar Meriemar says, Haning mile midate. That's only if he's doing it willingly. In other words, the rabbi said, we're going to make this ketuba being different. Okay, let me just remind you what that is. That means that when the father's giving the dowry for the daughter, he wants to know that that money will stay in his family. So what does he say? The ketuba says, if the woman dies and therefore she won't inherit the ketuba, the whole ketuba goes to her husband, he inherits the ketuba. But when he dies, it will be split among her children exclusively, her children with him, right? Not among all his other children. Let's say he has a second wife, or let's say he was married to someone before and had children, or let's say he married someone after she died, right? So when he dies, all of her nedunya, her dowry, will go to her children exclusively. That's all meant to encourage the father to have a nice dowry. But it's to encourage. What does it mean to encourage? It means that they should do it willingly. Comes Yehuda bar Meriemar and says, if I'm there, I'm going to force him. He's going to feel forced to do it. That's not, the rabbis didn't force anyone to give more money to their daughters. They just encourage it. There's a big difference between encourage and force it. So Amar le, Rav Papa says to him, obviously, right, what's Rav Papa's interest? He wants his son to have a woman with a big dowry, right? So Amar le, I didn't say come in and force him. I just said come on in. Don't force him, just come on in and be present with me. Amar le, ma'alai didi haynu asui. He says, my presence alone will force him. Well, famous last words. Let's see what happens. So in the end, Rav Papa apparently had good persuasion skills. And I guess also Yehuda bar Meriemar, you could see he came out to greet Rav Papa. He obviously felt somewhat respectful of Rav Papa. Rav Papa really wanted him to come. He forces him, he convinces him. It's actually funny. They were using the word about forcing. In the end, apparently, right, he forced Yehuda bar Meriemar, convinced him, but in a little bit of force, and he comes in. But what does he do? He just sits there quietly. He doesn't open his mouth, which you would think would be useful. But let's see what happens. Savar hahu mirtach uratach. So what's happening now is Abba Sura'ah says, okay, I'm going to give her this, that, and the other thing. And Yehuda bar Meriemar sits there silently, doesn't say anything. Well, shtikaka hoda'ah, right? We say silence doesn't mean nothing, right? Silence could mean an admission. We don't know, but silence could often be interpreted in many ways. So Abba Sura'ah sees that Rav Papa is Yehuda bar Meriemar is silent, and he thinks that he's angry with him for not giving more money. So what does he do? He ends up writing his entire, all of his money he puts into the dowry, because he keeps upping it and upping it and upping it, waiting for Yehuda bar Meriemar to say, good job. He never says good job, to which even after he writes everything, he still keeps silent, to which Abba Sura'ah says to him, L'sof Amar Le, in the end, he says to him, Hashtanami lo mishtayimar, you're still not speaking? Chaye Damar, I swear in the name of, I think in your name, I think he's saying, Lo shviki midi l'nafshai, I didn't leave anything to myself. I don't have any more money to give away. Well, why aren't you happy with me? So finally, Yehuda bar Meriemar opens his mouth. Very painful statement. Amar Le, Iminai Didi, if you were listening to me, as if I have my way, Afilu hainami dekata floni chale. I'm not happy with the fact that you gave away all your money to your daughter's dowry. It was obviously a ridiculous thing to do. Amar Le. So what does Abba Sura'ah say, right? This is what we claim. Mekach ta'ut, right? It was a mistake. I misunderstood you. Hashtanami ahadarbi. Okay, so let me go back to what you wanted. To which Rav Yehuda bar Meriemar says, Amar Le, Shavuye nafsha hadran alo kamina. I didn't say you should take back your words. That's also not a good thing to do. So basically, Abba Sura'ah gets totally stuck into basically writing away all of his property to the dowry. What do you take away from this story? I thought it was interesting. I looked at the Meiri. The Meiri says here that you learn from here that you should not get involved at all, and don't even walk into a room when that's happening. And if you start to see this happening, walk out of the room. Almost like Yehuda bar Meriemar was in the wrong here. That we knew he anticipated this kind of thing, and he should have been smart enough to walk out of the room, which he doesn't, right? He obviously was a little bit stuck in between Rav Papa wanting him to be there and kind of seeing what was going on. Obviously, Abba Sura'ah also should have just asked and been a little bit more verbal about things, to kind of say, instead of assuming what Yehuda bar Meriemar really thought, right? So you have to be very careful when you're interpreting people's silence, how to interpret it. Interesting story. Okay, now we get to the sugya that's a little bit more complicated. Ba'amine Rav Yeimar Saba me Rav Nachman. Rav Yeimar Saba asked Rav Nachman the following question. We're actually not going to see Rav Nachman. Rav is going to interject, and then we're actually not going to get an answer to this question. Machra ktubata leba'ala. If she sells her ketuba to her husband, let's talk about selling a ketuba in general. A woman basically has a ketuba. A ketuba is a commitment of money in the event that the husband divorces her or dies. Now, it's obviously, we don't know. There's 50-50 chance. Maybe it's more than 50-50 because it's either divorce or death, right? Or she dies first, right? So there's some sort of a chance there about whether she'll ever see this money or not. Either she'll see the money, right, because he'll die or divorce her, or she'll die first, he'll inherit the whole ketuba, and then eventually it will go to her and his sons, okay? So it's not really, in that scenario, it's not really hers to sell, okay? But we'll talk about this. This is where it gets a little bit complicated. Normally, when a woman sells her ketuba to some third party, let's say I'm desperate for money, and I go and I sell my ketuba to you, for example. So what I'm basically selling is my rights to the ketuba, which is if the husband, okay, let's say my ketuba is worth 200 zuz. So you may buy it for 150 or 120, right? Because you're basically saying, I'm buying rights to something that maybe I'll get nothing from this, because if I die first, you won't get anything, because my husband will inherit it. But if he dies or divorces me, you'll get 200 zuz. So you're willing to put some money down, right? It's like going almost gambling, right? You're taking a gamble. Maybe you'll make more money. And I'm desperate for the money, so I'll sell it to you. What if I sell it to my husband? And when I sell it to my husband, there's certain rights that continue to be mine even in scenario 2. In scenario 1, he's basically, okay, now remember what happens. He owes me, if he dies or divorces me, he owes me, again, either him or his estate will owe me 200 zuz if there's any additional thing he added. And my whole dowry, I will get back. Because remember, he has rights to it when we're married. He gets all the proceeds. I will get it fully when in the event of that. So I sold him that. So he gets all that. I won't get anything. If he dies or divorces me, right? His kids will inherit all that equally. What if I die first? And then if he dies after that, which eventually he'll die, that money is supposed to go to my male children. But if I sold him my ketuba and I sold him that also, then maybe I sold away the rights of my male children. And that's the question here. Okay, he says, I can't sell those rights to anyone else, but theoretically I could sell them to my husband. And then what would it mean to sell them to my husband? Theoretically, it could mean, and that's the question, if I sell my whole ketuba, does it include the ketuba nindichrin? That basically, instead of being, and Rashi says it well, instead of pakala torat yerushat avia, he no longer inherits her dowry. He now bought her dowry. So if he bought it, it should be split between his children evenly when he dies. So that's basically the question, okay? Or do we say no? She sold him the rights, the things that were hers. That's not really hers. It's her male children, but maybe she doesn't have rights to sell it. Like if she sold it to someone else, she wouldn't be selling that part. So that's really the question. Is she selling the rights of her male children? In which case, again, they will get it, but they'll only get, let's say you had 10 children, 5 from her, 5 from another woman, they'll only get 1/10 of it rather than 1/5 of it. Okay, so that's the big question. Amarle Rava, instead of answering him, okay, he asked Rav Nachman, but Rava was there, and Rava says, why didn't you ask the question about a woman who forgoes her ketuba? Instead of selling it to her husband, she says, you don't need to give me a ketuba. Okay, she says, I'm giving up my ketuba rights. Now then, it would also be a question. Is she giving up just her ketuba rights in the event that he dies or divorces her? Or is she also giving up her son's rights? So now Rashi says, why does he really ask this question? He points out 2 important things. What's unique about mochelet that's not in mocheret? He says, b'tibai lach mochelet, in that Rashi. Number 1, shuhu davar matzui min hamecher. It's less common for a woman to sell her ketuba to her husband than it is for her to just say, you know what, you can have my ketuba rights. It's more likely she would do that. So you're better off asking a question that's more likely. And secondly, it's a bigger question. Why? What's the difference between mochelet and mocheret? Mochelet, she doesn't get anything from it. She didn't benefit from saying, right, maybe he was a little nicer to her, I don't know, but she didn't gain any financial reward. In the mocheret case, in the sale, she got money. So she benefited. Now, when you benefit, you're willing to give up more. So maybe it's more likely she gave up her ketuba b'nin dichrin. But in a mocheret case, when she just says, I don't really need my ketuba anymore, she didn't gain anything from it. So therefore, maybe she didn't give up as much. Maybe she only meant the half of if you die, if you predecease me or divorce me. But maybe she wasn't giving up the rights of her male children. So we said, why didn't you ask the question about mochelet? To which Rav Yeimar answers. Basically, he's going to answer, the bigger question is actually mocheret. It's a question in both, but the bigger question is mocheret for a different reason. And this is where we're going to see a lot of this today, where one could use one logic to prove one thing, right? Where Rava thought mochelet was the bigger question, and Rav Yeimar is going to say, no, I think mocheret is the bigger question. So Amarle, hashta mocheret kamebayali. Since I asked about mocheret, we're going to basically end the line with, I don't need to even ask about mochelet. Obviously, if she forgoes, it's the same question. But even though it's not exactly the same question, this is part of where the sugya becomes complicated. It's not really the same question. The whole point is they're different. But the point is, there's more of a likelihood of asking by mocheret, there's more of a question, deliberation, than there is in if she forgoes it. Why? So he says, sometimes people ask a question, they don't really say where they're getting at. So now he finally clarifies, this was what was bothering me. Before we focus, Rava was focusing on what's the benefit she gets. The more benefit she gets, the more likely she is to give up on her rights. He says, no. The more benefit she gets is not a relevant factor. What's the issue here? She sold it. Why did she sell her ketuba? She was obviously desperate for the money. Nobody would sell their ketuba unless they're desperate for money. So since she was desperate for money, we could say, Zuze Anse, that forced her to do something. Now, when you're forced to do something, you're maybe going to be giving up unless, right? Because it's the opposite of what we said before, right? Yes, you're getting money, but you're only getting money because you had no choice and you were desperate. So you were willing to, because you were desperate, you sold part, but you didn't mean to sell all your rights. You were just stuck. So you sold something, but you didn't mean to sell everything. So that's the bigger question. So let's read the words inside. Even though she was forced into it, still I'm going to ask, maybe she gave up the rights of the ketuba being different. In other words, even though it was by force and she didn't really want to do this, whereas a mochelet, she gave up her rights willingly. So maybe she gave up all her rights, right? Then still you'd ask the question. You'd still have to say, is she giving up the rights? But my bigger question is, can you say because she was forced, maybe she didn't, or maybe she did anyway? Da'amina, because I could say, it's like someone who got whipped 100 times on the head. Rashi says it's with some whip that has some metal implement at the end of it, and she gets whipped in the head 100 times, meaning she was forced to do this. And therefore, mochelet mebaya, you don't even need to ask about mochelet. Obviously, it's a question about mochelet. Okay, so that's kind of the end of that section. So just to clarify what's the difference, part of what's complicated here is what's between this and the next line, where Rava starts to say, this is obvious, and my question is this, and then he answers it. It seems like the way Rashi explains it anyway, is that the first question was a case where she sold all her rights to the ketuba to her husband, including the side for the sons. And the question is really, right, including the event that she dies first. The question is that effective? Was she just forced to do it and didn't really mean it, and we're not going to take it away from her? Right? So is it or not? But in this next case, Amar Rava pshitali mocheret ketubatal, it's obvious to me, and he's going to say two things are obvious, and then he's going to have a question about one, and then he's going to answer the question. Mocheret ketubatal acherim yesh la ketuba b'nin dichrin. Now he goes to a case where the woman is just selling, as I told you before. If I sold you my ketuba, I can't sell you the half of if I die first, because then I don't have rights to anything. Even though it goes to my sons, that's not my rights. It really goes to my husband. He gives it to my sons. That's not my right to sell. I can only sell what I have rights to. So if I sell my rights to you, then what happens? Yesh la ketuba b'nin dichrin. Then obviously, since I can't sell the other half, meaning, right, possibility two, if I die first, obviously then if I die first, the fact that I sold you my ketuba, if I end up dying first, you bought nothing, and my ketuba goes to my husband, he inherits it, and when he dies, my sons will get all of it, and they won't have to split it with his other children. That's obvious. My taima, and now there's a few of these today, which my taima doesn't really mean what's the reason. It's kind of an added reason, because the real reason is I didn't actually sell it. I only sold rights if the event that he dies first or divorces me. I didn't sell rights if I died first. So if I died first, my sons get it. But they're adding another reason, my taima zuze ansua. Also, in addition, she was forced to sell. She obviously was desperate for the money, and that's why it's going to be a more minimal sale. But mochelet ketubata leba'ala, if I forego my ketuba, then ein la ketuba b'nin dichrin. Right? Then I basically forego my ketuba, and my ketuba includes a stipulation that it will go to my male sons if I die first. Since I basically said to my husband, I'm foregoing my ketuba, and that's something that's that's part of the rights of the ketuba, and he basically gets it entirely, and it gets split up among his children evenly. I've foregone that. So that's the way Rava understands that, and then he says, but what's my question? Right? Oh, sorry. Why? Because my taima achule achilte. Because she's basically foregoing all her rights. Okay. And the more so, Rashi adds this extra thing, which is she's basically, the rabbis penalize her. Okay. Now she didn't, foregoing her ketuba really means the side that if I die first. But Rashi adds here that achule achilte, we don't like that she foregoes her ketuba. That's a right the rabbis gave her. And she's basically being flippant about it. If she's being flippant about it, well, then we'll penalize her and we won't let her sons get it. We'll basically say, you were flippant about the ketuba, we're going to get rid of the whole thing. So he does it, right? Mochelet ketubata. She was flippant about it. Well, because of that, she's going to lose something that she wasn't even meaning to give up, but she's going to lose it. But by Rabba, his question is, Mocheret ketubata leba'ala. What if she sells? Now, in this case, you can't say he's asking Rav Yeimar's question because Rabba didn't have an answer to Rav Yeimar's question. So it must be, what if she sells her part of the ketuba, meaning, right, she's very specific in saying, I'm selling if you divorce me or die, I'm selling you the rights, you'll get all that money, right? All that will go to you or to your estate. Well, is that kimocheret lacherim dami or kimocheret leba'ala dami? Which one is it in terms of the ketubah in dichrin? Okay, are we saying she was mizalzelet b'ketuba, or are we saying zuze anse, right? So what is it? And also, by the way, zuze anse, what does that resolve? It resolves the issue that Rashi adds here. That's why, again, Rashi's additions are very helpful. Zilzule means she was flippant about it. She wasn't careful about it. She didn't care about it. Zuze anse means she wasn't being flippant. She was forced. It wasn't like she said, I don't care about this ketuba. It was that she was desperate for the money. And therefore, we don't penalize her for being flippant with her ketuba. She wasn't being flippant. She was just totally desperate. So they say, Batar de Bayahar, the Pasha, after he asked the question, he answers it, which makes a lot of sense because, again, Zuze Ansua, she was forced to do it because she was desperate. So therefore, we don't penalize her for being flippant about it. And therefore, she gets, right, the ketubah in dichrin stays intact. Okay? The sons get her ketubah in the event that she dies and then he dies. Okay, so now, Mativ Rav Idi bar Abba. Rav Idi bar Abba now questions this from a different source. What's this source? You might remember. I'm sure you remember this case if you learn yevama, which is a woman whose husband disappears. And one witness comes forward and said he dies. And she goes and gets married based on that testimony. The rabbis wanted to ensure that she does her homework properly, right? That we don't just rely on one witness, but we rely on the woman doing her own research to make sure her husband is not alive. Therefore, if she gets married and he shows up on the scene, the rabbis were very strict with her and penalized her in many, many ways. Remember, they make her get divorced from the first husband and they make her get divorced from the second husband. She doesn't get a ketubah from either one of them. Now, we're now coming in the middle of a source, and it says, what if this happened? One witness came and said her husband died. She went and got remarried. Her husband shows up on the scene. She doesn't yet get divorced from either one of them, and she dies. So, ein yorshim shalzeh ve'ein yorshim shalzeh yorshim ketubata. Not his sons, not her son, not either, right? First husband's sons, second husband's sons, none of them inherit her ketubah, to which the Gemara says, they asked a question there, what ketubah are we talking about? Didn't we already say she doesn't get any ketubah? To which Amar Rav Papa, ketubah b'nei dichrin. She doesn't get the ketubah. The husband gets the ketubah, but what happens to the ketubah? Well, that's the question. When the husband dies, if she dies and the husband dies, what happens? Do her male children still get it? Is that something she loses or not? So, again, what does it say? Ein yorshim shalzeh ve'ein yorshim shalzeh. There is no ketubah b'nei dichrin here. Okay, all of that is out the window. Ve'amai. Now, why? Hachanami, based on what you said before, she wasn't being flippant about her ketubah. Hachanami lema yetzer anasan. This is a fascinating line. We're basically going to say she was forced into doing this. What forced her? Her yetzer. She obviously, the assumption of the rabbis, and this, we never really saw this explicitly in yevama, which is interesting, the language here. It's basically saying this woman must have been so lustful after the second husband that she basically didn't do her research properly about her husband. Someone said her husband died. She said, great, I really like this guy. I'm going to go marry him. But what's fascinating about it is they look at it as her yetzer forced her to do this, right? Her evil inclination pulled her toward this man. It wasn't really her doing, wasn't really her fault. And therefore, if you're going to say, Zuze say the same way someone could be desperate for money and do something out of desperation for money, she was desperate for this man, and basically it wasn't within her control fully. And therefore, why wouldn't you say, again, obviously we're going to penalize her, but why penalize her sons, right? And as the ketubah in dichrin, if someone was forced, we assume they're giving up on their own rights, but they're not giving up on someone else's right, their son's rights. So the answer, no. This isn't a question because hatam knasu de kansua rabbanan. We know that the rabbis went crazy there with knasot, with penalties for the women. They went over, right, way over, and that was what they decided. They wanted to prevent this kind of situation from happening. They wanted to ensure, this is when they do preventative measures to make sure the women did a research properly. They didn't want women going around and marrying someone else when their husband was still alive. They took that very seriously. And therefore, they instituted all these penalties to prevent women from abusing their privilege here and not really doing their homework properly. And that's why we can't ask questions from that source. And therefore, we distinguish between the two cases. Okay, that's the end of that complicated piece. Next piece. Yativ Rabin Bar Chanina Kamei de Rav Chisda. Rabin Bar Chanina was in front of Rav Chisda. The Yativ v'ka'amar mishmei de Rabbi Elazar. And he said in the name of Rabbi Elazar, Mocheret ketubata lebaala ein la mizonot. They're not really clear here about what they mean, but most of the commentaries say this means in the event that her husband dies. So again, what are mizonot? Mizonot are the rights the woman has. She also has rights to mizonot when they're married, but they assume what they're talking about if the husband dies. If she gave up her ketuba rights, she forgoed her ketuba to her husband, she doesn't get mizonot. Well, part of the stipulation is, I will feed you. In the event that I die, you'll get food. Okay, we've talked about this many times. What happens? Husband dies. The woman can get monthly food or weekly, whatever it might be, stipend for food until such point that she wants her whole lump sum of the ketuba, right? She kind of has a choice. She could take the whole lump sum of the ketuba, but then she can't get these weekly payments, or she can get the weekly payments until she demands her ketuba. Now, there's certain cutoff points, even if that's not the case. We'll talk about that. That's coming up in the next sugya. I think it's in already tomorrow's daf, but we'll get to that when we get to it. But the point is, since she forgoes her ketuba in this case, she can't demand mizono because that's connected to the ketuba. And she said, I don't have any ketuba rights anymore. I'm giving up my ketuba right. So she gives up her mizono. Amar lei. So the reaction to the statement of his was, you quoted this in the name of Rabbi Elazar. If you hadn't said this in the name of some great person, Rabbi Elazar, I would have said to you, this is someone who gives back bad for good. His wife did something nice by giving up on her ketuba rights, and now he's giving her bad in her face. He's not going to feed her when she's a widow. What kind of craziness? Someone like that, lo tamushra ami beto, evil should never depart from that person's house, meaning that person should be cursed for doing this. So if you hadn't said the name of Rabbi Elazar, I would have said, what a crazy thing. Of course he should be feeding her. Another situation, Rav Nachman, Ula, and Avimi Bar Rav Papi were sitting, and Rav Chia Bar Ami was sitting with them, and now we're going to have a debate. The three of them are going to say one thing, and Rav Chia is going to come and question them. A man came by, whose wife, but not wife, betrothed, okay, they were only betrothed, she died. And the question is, remember that we had a whole discussion a while back about the arusa, an engaged woman. Does she have a ketuba already, right? Normally they wrote the ketuba before the wedding. What if they wrote it during the engagement time period? Would it be valid, right? Would she be able to collect the money from then or from later? We had all these discussions about what the ketuba is during the time of erusin. Some people thought there is a ketuba for betrothed women. Some people thought there isn't. And then we also had, right, so it's unclear, does this sugya think that hold women who are betrothed do have a ketuba, or is it in the case where he actually wrote a ketuba to her? It's very unclear here, just so you know, okay? So now, one of the stipulations in a ketuba is, in place of your ketuba, I will bury you. In other words, I'm going to inherit your ketuba when you die, but I agree to bury you, the husband says, right? That's part of the stipulation. So therefore, Amrele, they said to him, these three rabbis, Zil Kval or Havla Ketubata. Either give her back all her ketuba money, meaning give it to her relatives, or pay for the burial. You got to do one or the other. You're responsible. To which Amralu Rav Chia doesn't like this. He says, what are you talking about? You're not responsible for ketuba when you're just betrothed. Tanina, it says in the following source, Ishto Arusa, when they're betrothed, Lo Onem velo matamela. He's not a status of Onem when she dies. He can't become impure to her if he's a Kohen. V'chein he, and likewise she, Lo onen, if he dies, she doesn't become an onem for him. And lo metamelon, she doesn't become impure to him. That's all the question, what on earth that means, because there's no forbidden for a Cohen, right? Some people say this just means she doesn't have to sit shiva for him, or she doesn't have to be responsible for dealing with the burial, things like that. Again, there's different interpretations. I'll leave it right now. It's not really the main germane to our discussion. Meta, if she dies, Eino Yorsha, he doesn't inherit all of her dowry, okay? Because the dowry is only from marriage. Metu govak tubata. If he dies, she gets the 200 zuz and whatever he promised her in the ketuba. Tama de metu. Now, he says from there, Rav Yeimar says, that's because he died. But ha metahi ein la ketuba. It only says she gets the ketuba if he dies, but it doesn't sound like he gets the ketuba. And basically, what it seems like, again, based on commentaries' explanation here, that those three rabbis thought that when they say ketubata keneged, right, k'vurata keneged ketubata, that he buries her in place of the ketuba, they thought it meant the 200 zuz and the basic ketuba. But what he's saying is it's the nedunya. What her father brings in the dowry, that goes to the husband, and in place of that, he has to bury her. But that doesn't happen from erusin. Okay, notice only if he dies does she get the ketuba. It doesn't say if he dies, she gets the ketuba. It doesn't say if she dies, he inherits the dowry. So that obviously isn't true. And since he doesn't inherit the dowry, he doesn't have to pay her burial fees. So Rav Yeimar disagrees entirely. And then this is the tricky part. My time, and what's the reason? We already explained the reason. And the reason they write here isn't exactly the reason we just explained. But anyway, we add this extra thing. We'll try to explain it. Amar Rav Shaya, she'en ani koreba. The words of the ketuba don't ring true in this case. What does the say? When you marry someone else, and why am I promising you all this money? Because in the event that you marry someone else after I die, you'll have what to go into the marriage with. You'll have a dowry. Now, so you could say maybe because this is talking about a dowry, but it's not really, because it could be talking about the Tosefet ketuba, and that she actually gets. It's a little bit tricky, this line. The Meiri said the language when you marry someone means when you marry someone like you married me. And in this case, you didn't marry me, so therefore the ketuba is not really relevant yet. Okay, it's a little tricky because the ketuba is somewhat relevant, just not the nedunya part of the ketuba. And that's why these stipulations about I'll bury you are also not relevant. Okay, so again, it's not 100% clear how to read this line. I'll kind of leave it at that. So we basically have these three rabbis who says she gets buried, right? He has to bury her. Rav Yeimar says, no way does he have to bury her. The burial is in place of the dowry that he inherits, and he doesn't inherit the dowry in the event that they weren't married. They were only betrothed, and therefore he doesn't have to bury her. Likewise, Ki'ata Ravin, when Ravin came from Israel to Babylonia, Amarish Lakish, he said the name of Rish Lakish, Arusa Shemeta Ein La Ketuba. Okay, again, the same thing. She doesn't have a ketuba, meaning, right, he doesn't have to bury her. Take your great statement and throw it to the thorns. Rav Hoshai already explained this in Babylonia. Thanks for bringing your Torah from Israel, but we already know that. Not a very pleasant thing to say to someone who brings some, something into the Beit Midrash from afar, but he's basically saying thanks, but we already know what you're saying. Now we're going to get to the next line. Okay, that was all the hard part of today's stuff. It's going to get a little simpler from here on in. So although even here there's again, a few other things that are open to interpretation. Anyway, one of the stipulations in the ketuba, again, is that the banin nukvin, which basically means the banot nekevot, it means the female children, the daughters that you will have from me, will get sustenance from my estate in the event that I die. So, right, it's saying your children will be taken care of. Rav Tane Adatila. Now it says in the Mishnah, until such time that they get taken by men, meaning they get married or betrothed. It's not exactly clear. But Rav Tane Adatila Kon Gavli, that was his version of the Mishnah. But Levi had a different version of the Mishnah. Levi Tane Adati Bgaran, until they become a bogeret. Remember what that is? That's Ktana Na'ara Bogeret, right? It's 12 years, 2 sarot, right? Pubic hairs, and then 6 months after, they become a bogeret. So one says it's until they get married or betrothed, not clear, and one says until they get older. So now the Gemara asks, wait a minute. L'Rav afagav de bagal. Rav's going to say they still get money even once they're a bogeret, once they're of age. Ula Levi afagav de insad, and Levi thinks even once they're married, they're still going to get fed from the father. That makes no sense. Ella, bagar below insa below bagar, if they came of age and weren't married, or if they got married, didn't come of age, kule amalu pli. Nobody disagrees. Ki pligi ba'arusa below bagar. The debate is specifically if she's betrothed, but didn't come of age. Okay, so she's, let's say, 11 and betrothed. Question then is, right? And then Levi says, tibgaran, right? Until she's a bogeret. And Rav says, she was already taken. She doesn't get money from the father's house anymore. And likewise, we see a brayta that Levi says this, until they become a bogeret and their time came to get married. By the way, their time came to get married. We're going to see this soon, and we saw it on the first stop, which is it means a year passed from the time of the betrothal, and then already the husband starts being required to give her mazono. That was what we said, the importance of Wednesday, that only Wednesday in that week, because he wasn't expected to marry her till Wednesday of that week, but then he's already responsible for food. First, the Gemara says, wait a minute, Tarte, Levi requires both that she's married and a bogeret. Didn't we already say no? Ella o tivgaran o yamte zimnehon le'insaba. Okay, either she's a bogeret or her time came to get married. Kitinai. Now they're going to say it's a machloket tanaim. Ad matay bat nizonet, ad shteres. Until what time does a girl get mizona? Until she gets betrothed. Mishum Rabbi Elazar amru ad shtivgar. Mishum Rabbi Elazar, they said no until she gets older, and which means also or getting married. In other words, betrothal is not sufficient. Tani Rav Yosef brought a brayta that said, Adi Havayun. This is all dealing with the same issue until she gets Havaya, is always a language of marriage, but it's a confusing language of marriage because sometimes it's used to mean betrothal, sometimes it's used to mean marriage. So this didn't really help us. They asked, Havaya de Erusin or Havaya de Nisuin? This brayta he brought says, Havaya, did it mean betrothal or did it mean marriage? Teku, we don't know. Amar le Rav Chisda le Rav Yosef. Okay, so now we're going to continue along the same line of questioning. Rav Chisda says to Rav Yosef, Mishmele minete Rav Yehuda, because we have a machlok, we don't know who holds what. He says, did you hear from Rav Yehuda what the halacha is? Arusa yesh la mizono, no en la mizono. Does she get mizono? Does she not? So again, right, this is all what's fascinating. What we're saying is, what is her status in the middle of the erusin? Is her husband expected to take care of her or the father's estate, right? Who's responsible? As soon as the husband's responsible, it takes away the responsibility from the father's estate. So the question is, does she have mizonot or not from the estate of the father? Okay, like I said, here there's some debate about what it means mizonot. Maybe it means from the husband, but we're going to go with the interpretation it means from the father's estate. Amar le, Rav Yosef says to Rav Chisda, Mishma lo shmiali. I didn't actually learn it from Rav Yehuda. Ela misfara leila. But if I say logically, she doesn't have mizonot as soon as she's betrothed. Why? Kevan de irsa lo nichale de titazi. Once she's betrothed to her husband, remember, she's still living in her father's house, but her father's dead. And in this case, the man is not going to want to have his betrothed wife demeaning herself to go beg money from the orphans. So he's going to, right, basically he'll take on responsibility because it's ridiculous to have his wife to be humiliated to go begging for money. Amarle, Rav Chisda says, if you don't have a tradition from Rav Yehuda, well, misvar itla, I'm going to argue with your logic and say, I think out of logic, for logical reasons, she should get mizonah from the father's estate. Why? Since she's not living with him yet, and maybe he won't end up going through with the marriage. It's actually fascinating, right? We know that people break engagements, I wouldn't say often, but it definitely happens. But those days, halachic engagement was much more serious. And yet, they're still concerned, and we're going to see this later. We saw this already with the Kohen, and she doesn't get truma yet, because maybe he'll find a blemish in her, and he won't want to marry her. We'll talk about this blemish as we go on. But the point is, since she's not yet living with him, and he might end up not going through with the marriage, he's not going to just throw away money to her until it's a done deal, right? This is a fascinating question about what your status is when you're engaged, right? Again, this isn't today's engagement, it's halachic engagement, which happens nowadays under the chuppah, but it's kind of saying, right, how much is he going to take care of her at that stage? Okay, how much is he committed to her? So two opposite approaches, and now basically we're going to see the exact flip. The Rav Yosef says what Rav Chisda said, Rav Chisda said what Rav Yosef said. Some people say, Amarle, Rav Yosef said, Mishma lo shmieli misvar itle. I don't have a tradition, but it's logical to me. She should get the money for the food from her father because he's not going to just throw money at her if they're not married yet. And to that, Rav Chisda says, if you're going to try to prove logic, I'll prove you the opposite logic. He's not going to let her humiliate herself once they're already engaged. So again, it's just the flip argument, right? Who said what? Siman de Gavre, this is Siman for the next 5 questions. We're going to only learn 2 of them today. Sak Zaraf, those are the Rashi Tevot for the rabbis' names. And these are the Simanim of what we're asking about. Ma'ana, Yevama, Shniya, Rusa, Vanusa. Okay. They asked Rav Sheshet, a woman, remember the miyun, she gets betrothed by her brother or mother because the father's dead. She goes to marry someone else. It's only marriage midirabanan. When she becomes of age, she can basically, or even until that point, she can basically say, until the point where she's 12 with 2 simanim, or there was a debate exactly how many simanim, but basically she could say, I'm not interested in being married to and go back to her father's house. Does she go back to getting mizonot now or not? So, right, she'd have to be under bogeret age, otherwise she wouldn't get mizonot anyway. Amalu Rav Sheshet Tani Tua, let's learn it from here. Almana bebeit avia, grusha bebeit avia, a widow in her father's house, a divorcee in her father's house, shomer yavam bebeit avia. Okay, the commentaries say from erusin only. Once she's married, she for sure doesn't get mizonot anymore. But here she was betrothed. Yesh la mizonot. Rabbi Yehuda says, Oda bebeit avia yesh la mizonot, eina bebeit avia ein la mizonot. She's still in her father's house, she gets mizonot. She's no longer in her father's house, she doesn't get mizonot. So they say Rabbi Yehuda Hainu Tanakama, they seem to be saying the same thing. The difference between them must be specifically our case, which means it's a machloket. The Tanakama Savar Ila, the rabbis are saying she does have, because all these people, when they go back to Beit Avia, they get. And Rabbi Yehuda Savar Leila, that she's like an Arusa, according to Tanakama. Rabbi Yehuda says, what do you mean? She was married. It's true, she did miyun, and in the end, she wasn't right. And this is a fascinating question about miyun in general. Is it as if she was never married? Or she was married, just didn't need a divorce? So that's a really big question about miyun in general, which we saw different debates about before. This is another debate. Last thing for today. If someone gets married, their husband dies without children, she marries the brother. And then she has a daughter, and then the brother dies. So now, does the daughter of this yabam get mizonot from his estate or not? What would be the question? Well, kevan da amar mar ketuba tal nichsa ba'ala rishon. These are all these things from Yibum now, yevama, coming into practice in Ketubot, which is, well, her ketuba, if you remember, the yabam doesn't give her a ketuba. She keeps her old ketuba from her first husband. So since he didn't give her a ketuba, maybe he doesn't need to feed her. It's part of the stipulations of the ketuba. So maybe leitla, she doesn't get. O dilma, or maybe we say, kevan di leitla me rishon kinu la Rabbanit misheni. In the event that the first husband she didn't have a ketuba, meaning let's say he had no money left, and then she couldn't get a ketuba from that money, then the second husband, the yabam, has to give her a ketuba. Since there's a possibility that he might have to give her a ketuba and basically fill in, maybe we'd say, itla. Maybe then the daughter does get mizonot, since there's this potential that he could be giving her a ketuba, that maybe he is responsible for the mizonot of the daughter. They end the question with teku. We really don't know. Okay, so we'll continue with another 3 questions like this. Which girls get mizonot, which girls don't get mizonot? It's a very relevant and practical question, which is who's going to take care of these orphan girls, right? And who has to feed her, who doesn't, in what situation, etc. We will continue with this tomorrow. Have a good day, everyone. Chodesh Tov, Shavua Tov.